You think you know Japan. Cherry blossoms, bullet trains, polite bows, and neon billboards. The country that opens everything to tourists, photographs everything for social media, catalogs every grain of rice in every prefecture. The most documented nation on Earth. Then how do you explain a tomb the size of 3 city blocks that no human being has officially entered for 16 centuries? A mountain that legally cannot be excavated because the mountain itself is a god. A sealed wooden warehouse where for 1,300 years, no one without the emperor's written permission has been allowed to take a full inventory. A sword that nobody alive has seen, but that supposedly sits in a shrine box, untouched since the 12th century. Today, 7 sites in Japan that no archaeologist is permitted to dig. 7 places where the imperial line draws a quiet, unbreakable line. The most disturbing one is at the end.
We think of Japan as a transparent country. Open ports, open archives, open museums. But there is another Japan underneath it. A Japan administered by a single bureaucratic body called the Imperial Household Agency, the Kunaicho, founded in 1869, that controls roughly 900 ancient tombs across the country and refuses, on principle, to allow scientific excavation of any of them. Not Japanese archaeologists, not foreign teams, no one. Some of these sites have been sealed since the 5th century, some longer. The official reason is reverence. The unofficial reason, depending on who you ask, ranges from religious continuity to political necessity to something quieter and harder to name. Because every one of these sites, if opened, could potentially answer a question that the modern Japanese state has spent 150 years not asking. Where exactly does the imperial line come from? And how continuous is the story it tells about itself?
7 sites, 7 silences. We'll start with the largest tomb in the world. The first stop is Sakai, a quiet city in Osaka Prefecture. From the ground, you would never know it is there. A long band of trees, a wide moat, a few signs in Japanese asking you to be respectful. From the air, the picture changes. A keyhole, a perfect geometric keyhole carved into the landscape, 486 meters long, surrounded by 3 concentric moats, the outermost of which stretches the entire complex to over 800 meters. By area, it is the largest tomb on Earth, larger than the Pyramid of Khufu, larger than the mausoleum of the first Qin emperor. This is Daisen Kofun. Officially, it is the resting place of Emperor Nintoku, who, according to traditional chronology, died in the year 399. No archaeologist has ever entered it.
Not in the modern era, not in the past century and a half, not, according to the Imperial Household Agency, since the burial itself. There are stories of unauthorized intrusions in the 1870s, when a section of the inner mound collapsed during a typhoon and exposed a stone chamber. A few photographs were taken, a few drawings by a local official whose name appears in 19th century records and then disappears from them. The drawings showed a sarcophagus, ceremonial grave goods, fragments of armor, a sword. Then everything was resealed. The photographs disappeared into government archives, the drawings were declared the property of the imperial household, and the matter was officially closed. To this day, the originals have never been published. Reconstructions exist, made from memory by people who saw them once. The originals are somewhere in a vault in Tokyo, and the government has, on multiple occasions, declined to confirm whether they still exist. Modern scientists have measured the mound using ground-penetrating radar from outside the moats. They have estimated the structure of internal chambers, which appear to consist of a stone burial vault near the center of the mound, surrounded by what may be auxiliary chambers and possibly secondary burials. They have, with permission, surveyed the surface vegetation, mapped erosion patterns, and counted the Haniwa figures, the terracotta sentinels that ring the outer surface. They have not been permitted to open a single stone. And here is the problem. We do not actually know if Emperor Nintoku is inside. The identification was made in the Edo period, before modern archaeology existed, based on a mixture of geographic logic, oral tradition, and political need. Several Japanese scholars have argued, quietly, that the tomb's actual occupant may be someone else entirely, possibly an earlier ruler, possibly someone whose name does not appear in the official imperial chronology at all. To open it would be to find out. And finding out, in this case, is the thing the country has been most careful not to do. The stones say nothing. The moats reflect the sky. The keyhole stares up at every passing satellite and refuses to answer. 1,600 years of silence, by design.
Move south now, into the Nara Basin. A different mound, smaller, 280 meters long, but in some ways more dangerous. Hashihaka, the tomb of the Bridge Princess, according to the official designation. A figure of legend, vague enough to mean nothing. But the size and the date, around the middle of the 3rd century, line up almost exactly with a name from outside Japan altogether, a name preserved in a Chinese chronicle. Himiko, Queen of Yamatai. The shaman ruler of a country that paid tribute to the Wei dynasty in 238 was buried under a mound described in the Chinese text as 100 paces across, with over 100 attendants sacrificed at her funeral. The size matches, the date matches, the geography matches. But the Imperial Household Agency does not assign Hashihaka to Himiko, because to do so would create a problem. Yamatai, in the Chinese sources, is described as a confederation of more than 30 small states, ruled by a shaman queen who lived in a fortified compound with 1,000 female attendants and a single male servant who carried food in and messages out. She was, the chronicle says, never seen in public after her ascension. She had a younger brother who assisted her, but she ruled. After her death, a man tried to take the throne, and the country fell into chaos. A 13-year-old female relative of Himiko's was then installed, and order returned. This is a story about a country governed by women, in succession. The official Japanese imperial chronology, which claims unbroken descent from a single male line going back to the year 660 BCE, does not have room for a 3rd century queen who answered to a Chinese emperor and ruled a confederation that may have included most of Western Japan. Either Himiko is Yamatai, and the imperial story begins differently than the textbooks say, or Hashihaka is not Himiko, and a perfectly plausible identification is being avoided for political reasons. Limited radar surveys, conducted from outside the perimeter in the early 2000s, have shown what appear to be internal chambers. The Japanese Archaeological Association has on multiple occasions formally requested permission to investigate. The Kunei-cho has on every occasion refused. In 2008, a delegation of historians was finally allowed to walk the outer ring of the mound. Not inside, not even close to the chambers, just the surface. They were not allowed to photograph anything. They were not allowed to dig anything. They were allowed to walk.
A walk. That was the concession, after 100 years of asking. If Himiko is in there, Japan's earliest recorded history was not Japanese in the sense the modern state would prefer. The next site cannot be excavated because the site is alive. Drive 30 minutes south of Nara City. The land rises gently. A wooded mountain takes shape, 467 meters tall, perfectly conical, covered in old-growth cedar and cypress. This is Mount Miwa. There is no shrine on top. There is no temple. There is no building of any kind on the peak, because the mountain itself is the deity. The mountain is the god Omononushi. To dig the mountain would be to perform surgery on a living body that you cannot see and cannot anesthetize. This is not a metaphor. This is policy. The Miwa cult is one of the oldest continuous religious practices in Japan, predating Buddhism, predating the written language, predating the imperial state itself. The shrine at the foot of the mountain, Omiwa Shrine, has no main hall, no central building containing the deity, because the deity is the mountain you are facing when you bow. Pilgrims are permitted, with special permission, to climb a single narrow path. Cameras are forbidden. Eating, drinking, recording, picking up stones, moving leaves, all forbidden. Archaeologists are not permitted at all. There are believed to be pre-imperial ritual sites somewhere on the slopes, megalithic stone arrangements that predate any written record, but their exact locations have never been published, and the few photographs that exist were taken decades ago by priests who never released them. What is up there? Stones, certainly. Old ones. Stones placed by people whose names we will never know, for reasons we can only guess at, in a religion that has no founder, no scripture, no clear point of origin. The mountain holds them. The state, in deference to the mountain, refuses to count them. When your deity is the dig site, no one digs. Now we move to the objects themselves, to the three things that, according to the official narrative, define the legitimacy of every Japanese emperor for the past 2,000 years. The imperial regalia, the three sacred treasures. They are said to have been given by the sun goddess Amaterasu to her grandson, Ninigi no Mikoto, when he descended from heaven to rule the islands. A sword, a mirror, a jewel. The sword, Kusanagi, is said to reside at Atsuta Shrine in Nagoya. The mirror, Yata no Kagami, at the inner shrine of Ise. The jewel, Yasakani no Magatama, in the imperial palace itself, in a sealed chamber called the Kashiko Dokuro. No living person has seen any of them. Not the emperor, not the head priest of Ise, not the chief priest of Atsuta. The objects are wrapped in successive layers of silk and stored in lacquered boxes that have not been opened in centuries. At the imperial enthronement ceremony, the new emperor is presented with the boxes. He does not open them, he bows to them, he moves on. The ritual is the inheritance. The contents are theoretical. And there is a complication. The sword, Kusanagi, is said in the medieval war chronicles to have been lost at the Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185, when the boy emperor Antoku, 6 years old, drowned with the imperial fleet at the close of the Genpei War. His grandmother, Mino Ama, took him in her arms and jumped from the deck of the flagship with the sword and the jewel. The jewel was reportedly recovered, floating in its lacquered casket. The sword was not. The tale of the Heike describes it sinking with the boy emperor into the strait, into deep water that has never given it back. What is in Atsuta then? A replica made afterward to preserve the ritual continuity? The original, somehow recovered in a fishing net and quietly returned? A different sword entirely, a backup that was always there, while the lost one was something else. The shrine has never opened the box to confirm. The shrine has never been asked to. The most authoritative answer the Japanese state can give about whether its most sacred sword exists in its original form, in the place it is supposed to be, is that it might.
A scholar who studied the regalia in the early 20th century, with access greater than almost anyone before or since, wrote in his private papers, published only after his death, that he could not say what was in the boxes. He could not say there was nothing. He could not say there was something. He could only say that the lacquer was old and the silk wrappings were intact, and that to open them, even slightly, even partially, even just to look, would be a kind of vandalism for which the country had no procedure and no will. The boxes, he wrote, were not objects. They were arguments. To open one was to ruin it as an argument, regardless of what one found inside. The argument was the thing. We do not know if the objects exist. We bow to them anyway. The fifth site is a building, a wooden warehouse. It sits on the grounds of Todaiji Temple in Nara, raised on tall pillars in a style called Azekura Zukuri, designed to breathe with the seasons. It was built in the year 756 on the order of Empress Komyo to house the personal possessions of her late husband, Emperor Shomu. Robes, lacquerware, musical instruments, Silk Road glass, Persian textiles, Tang Dynasty mirrors, biwa lutes inlaid with mother of pearl. Over 9,000 objects. This is the Shosoin, the oldest continuously sealed imperial repository in the world. For 1,300 years, it has been opened only once a year
briefly in autumn, under the authority of the Imperial Household Agency for ventilation and inspection. The ritual is called the Kaifu no Gi. A handful of officials, dressed in robes that have not changed in centuries, walk in procession from Todaiji to the warehouse, break the imperial seal, open the doors for a fixed number of days while the dry autumn air circulates through the interior, and then reseal the doors with a new seal in the name of the current emperor. A small number of objects are removed each year and displayed at the Nara National Museum in an exhibition that draws lines around the block. The rest remain inside. Some have never been removed in any documented century. Some have not been formally inventoried in any meaningful modern sense since they were placed there in the 8th century. There are reports of cabinets within cabinets, of inner compartments whose contents are listed only by category, not by item, of a few wrapped bundles in the deepest part of the northern section that no curator has ever been authorized to unwrap, of Persian glass that may or may not be Persian, of biwa lutes whose inlaid mother-of-pearl maps a Silk Road route that historians have spent a century trying to reconstruct from indirect evidence, when one of the most direct pieces of evidence has been sitting in a box in Nara the entire time. We have catalogs of what is supposed to be there. We do not have a complete catalog of what is actually there. The repository is one of the most important historical archives in the world, and we are running it on an honor system that goes back to a moment when the Empress, grieving for her husband, asked that no one disturb his things. She got her wish. The wish has lasted 13 centuries.
The 6th site is underwater. It might not exist. It might be the most important archaeological discovery of the last 100 years, and it might be a coincidence of geology. And the Japanese authorities have, for nearly 40 years, gone out of their way to make sure no one finds out which. In 1986, a diver named Kihachiro Aratake, hunting hammerhead sharks off the coast of Yonaguni, the westernmost inhabited island of Japan, came around an underwater corner and saw something that, in his words, made him forget about the sharks. The water at that depth was clear, the kind of visibility that lets you see 30 meters in any direction, and what he was looking at was not the dark, rounded geology of a normal seabed. A flat platform, then a step, then another step, then a corner so sharp it looked machined, the kind of right angle you do not find in nature without help. 25 meters below the surface, in a region known for strong currents and earthquakes, was a structure that resembled nothing so much as a monumental terraced building, partially intact, partially collapsed, covered in coral and sea growth that had not been there long enough to hide the geometry underneath. Photographs of the Yonaguni Monument circulated through diving magazines, then through academic departments. A geologist at the University of the Ryukyus, Masaaki Kimura, became convinced the structure was at least partially artificial. He dove the site more than 100 times. He mapped what he interpreted as roads, drainage channels, a stylized human face carved into one of the walls, what looked like quarry marks at the bases of the largest blocks. He proposed the structure was on dry land between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago, before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, and was inhabited by a civilization that has left no other trace anywhere in the archaeological record of the Japanese archipelago.
Mainstream geologists have disagreed. The sharp angles, they argue, are natural fracture patterns in sandstone, common in that region. The platforms are natural terraces. The face is a face only if you want it to be. This is the official position. It is, depending on who you ask, either correct or extremely convenient. Because if Yonaguni is artificial, then Japan's history starts thousands of years earlier than the official record. There is, conspicuously, no government-funded effort to settle the question. Diving permits are limited. Major academic excavation has not been attempted. The site sits year after year as a tourist attraction for a few hundred experienced divers, and a debate that everyone has agreed to never quite resolve. Look at it once and you see a building. Look at it again and you see a cliff. Look at it a third time and you understand why no one in authority wants to look at all. And now, the 7th. It is not a site. It is a pattern. Walk back across everything we have just seen. Dyson, where we do not know who is buried. Hashihaka, where a queen the official history cannot accommodate may be lying under a mound that has never been excavated. Mount Miwa, where the deity itself prevents inquiry. The imperial regalia, 3 objects whose existence is theoretical. The Shosoin, where 13 centuries of locks separate us from a complete inventory. Yonaguni, where the question of human prehistory is met with a shrug. 6 places, 6 refusals, and 1 common thread. In 1869, the new Meiji government created the Imperial Household Agency. In the 1870s, working at speed, that agency assigned designations to roughly 900 ancient burial mounds across the country. Each was declared the official tomb of a specific emperor, empress, or prince listed in the 8th century chronicles, the Kojiki, the Nihon Shoki. These assignments were not based on excavation, because excavation was not permitted. They were not based on inscription, because the mounds carry no inscriptions. They were based, in most cases, on a combination of local tradition, geographic guesswork, and the strong political need of a young modern state just emerging from 2.5 centuries of feudal isolation to demonstrate to itself and to the world that its emperor descended, in an unbroken line, from a divine ancestor named in books written more than 1,000 years earlier.
That assertion of an unbroken imperial line from 660 BCE to the present is the foundation of modern Japanese national identity. It is the constitutional premise. It is the cultural anchor. It is also, when you press it, almost impossible to verify. Several Japanese historians, most notably Mizuno Yu in the mid-20th century, have argued that the line is not continuous, that there was a major dynastic break around the 5th or 6th century, possibly involving a violent succession or a foreign influence takeover, and that some of the earlier emperors named in the chronicles may be partly or entirely legendary, composite figures stitched together from older oral traditions. Other historians have suggested that the early imperial family may have had origins on the Korean peninsula, given the strong archaeological links between Kofun period material culture and contemporary kingdoms in southern Korea. This argument, when made publicly in Japan, tends to be met with silence at best, and tends, in less fortunate cases, to end academic careers. If any one of the 900 sealed tombs were opened and the contents did not match the assigned occupant, the official chronology would have a problem. If several were opened and several mismatched, the chronology would have a crisis. If one of them contained, say, an inscription in Korean or a body whose DNA pointed to a continental origin, the modern Japanese state would have to publicly revise the story it has told about itself since 1869. This is why the tombs stay sealed. Not because the dead need privacy, not because the stones are sacred, though they are, but because the act of looking inside is, at this point, an act with too many possible consequences for any government to authorize. A historian I read once described it like this: Japan is not hiding a secret. Japan is hiding the question of whether there is a secret. The two are not the same, and the second is much harder to talk about than the first.
7 sites, 7 silences. From the largest tomb on Earth to the smallest box in a palace chamber. From a mountain that breathes to a building underwater that may or may not have been built. They are not unrelated. They are not coincidences. They are the components of an unspoken policy that has held for 150 years. Do not dig. Do not open. Do not measure. Do not test. The country has prospered, modernized, opened itself to the world in every other respect. In this one respect, the country has agreed with itself to keep walking around the keyhole. Stop for a moment. Look at what we have seen. A tomb the size of a city block, sealed since the 5th century. A queen who may be buried under a mound nobody will name. A mountain that is a god. 3 sacred objects nobody has seen. A warehouse of 8th century treasure that has never been fully inventoried. A structure underwater that the geologists keep telling us is a cliff. And behind all of it, 900 mounds and a question nobody in authority will ask. What do all of these have in common? They are all the kind of place where, if you opened it, you might find that the story you have been told is wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, not in a way that ends a civilization. Just wrong enough that the official continuity, the elegant straight line from the sun goddess to the current emperor, becomes a curve, a break, a gap, a different story altogether. A story in which Japan begins later than it claims, or earlier than it claims, or somewhere other than it claims. A story in which the people who became the Yamato court arrived from somewhere, fought someone, replaced someone, instead of descending from the sky onto an empty island. None of these are catastrophic possibilities in any rational sense. They are simply different from the official version. And different is, sometimes, the thing a country is least equipped to absorb.
And so the stones stay where they are. The boxes stay closed. The mountain stays uncut. The warehouse stays sealed. The ocean keeps the cliff or the building or whatever it is to itself. And the modern, transparent, hyper-documented, hyper-educated Japanese state goes about its days with a quiet understanding that some questions are not, for now, useful to ask. Which of the 7 sites struck you the most? Write it in the comments. I genuinely want to know which one stays with you. If you found this worth your time, hit like. It tells the algorithm to send more of this kind of thing to people like you. And subscribe, because the next one goes underground, into a place that, depending on who you ask, either does not exist or has been there for 10,000 years. We are only just beginning to find out which.